Mr. Judge Carter.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment to the desk. It's marked Carter 2.
Clerk will report.
Amendment offered by Mr.
I ask
Carter.
unanimous consent that the amendment be
Without
placed
objection, the
read.
reading is dispensed with. Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I join with Mr. Adderholt and Mr. Nunley to offer this amendment. This amendment is a funding limitation that virtually identical to the language that has been carried in the Commerce, Justice, Science, CJS bill for 23 years and is consistent with the Hyde Amendment. This amendment is also virtually identical to what the President requested for CJS bill in his FY14 budget request. And this amendment includes an important modification added by Mr. Moran last year in the full committee markup for FY13 DHS appropriations bill. This amendment restricts ICE funding for abortions to only cases of rape, incest, or where it is necessary to preserve the life of the mother. This amendment simply codifies a policy that ICE already adheres to in its detention standards. Finally, I should note that when ICE predecessor, the Immigration Naturalization Service, or INS, was under DOJ, the agency was directly subject to this language. And with that said, I now yield to the amendment's co-sponsors, Mr. Adderholt and Mr. Nunley, for comments they may wish to make. Mr. Adderholt.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to commend you for offering this amendment. I was proud to offer this amendment last year. It was the right thing to do then. It's the right thing to do now. As you say, it's not new language. It's not a new standard. It's been carried for CJS for over 20 years. It simply codifies what ICE has already been following. It includes the Moran second-degree amendment from last year's debate that we had on this issue. And it is confined to ICE and mirrors the structure and substance that's been carried, as we mentioned, in CJS for, I think, 23 years. So I would encourage the committee to support it, and thank you for your leadership in bringing this up today.
Thank you, Mr. Adderholt. I'd also now like to yield to Mr. Nunley for any comments he'd like to make. No? All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I respectfully request the adoption of this amendment.
Mr. Price.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment. It's an unnecessary amendment. 40 years ago, the Supreme Court ruled that the U.S. Constitution protects a woman's right to choose. That decision has been the law of the land, but it's been under constant attack since the day it was rendered. These attacks have never been more strident than they are today, with attacks on women's reproductive freedom now extending even to contraception. Numerous restrictions in law have already conditioned and qualified reproductive choice in practice. Among these are prohibitions on the use of federal funds for abortion procedures, which are specifically applied to ICE and the Department of Homeland Security by President Obama's Executive Order 13535, issued on March 24, 2010. The requirements of this executive order are specifically formalized in Part 4.4 of ICE's detention standards. Many of us believe these restrictions are excessive, but they are a settled matter, and so I fail to see the point of raising the issue on this Homeland Security funding bill. The effect of this amendment is that it picks an unnecessary political fight, as if we didn't have enough controversies to divide this committee already. Before a similar amendment was offered last year, this bill had never touched on the topic of abortion because it is not relevant to the Department of Homeland Security. It falls far outside the lines of jurisdiction of this subcommittee. So why cast aside this bipartisan and cooperative effort that we've shared in crafting this bill for a redundant and politically charged amendment that accomplishes nothing and makes no change whatsoever in current law and procedure? It's a gratuitous effort, and I urge my colleagues to reject this amendment.
The gentlelady is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in strong opposition to this amendment because, frankly, it is shocking to me that this would even be considered today in this bill that is supported on both sides of the aisle. The Homeland Security bill is just not the place for divisive social riders. On this subcommittee and the Homeland Security Authorizing Committee, I've met with first responders, ICE agents, Border Patrol, many other security personnel, and frankly, not once have they said that women's reproductive health makes their job more difficult. Not once. Our focus should be to equip them with the tools to keep us safe. Weighing down this bill with ideological riders is a disservice to all first responders and our constituents who expect us to provide for the needs of our first responders and safety of our communities, prevent terrorism, and secure our borders. I ask that my colleagues oppose this amendment.
Mr. Quigley.
I might be allowed to.
Gentleman requests to be seated.
If I could.
That's correct.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad that this bill has bipartisan support, also important. What's frustrating to me is that, in the end, I suspect we all know where we're going to end up, and that's with a CR. And I've heard what you've said and what everyone else has said as I've begun my journey on this committee, that we need to get back to regular order. And that's absolutely the case. I think what's worse than the fact that we're going to end up in a CR where we're not back to regular order is that while we're trying to pass meaningful appropriations bills, we attach issues like this, which are unnecessary and, as has been said, gratuitous. I think it makes it even worse that we're not doing our jobs here, that we're not making these choices that we have to make and set priorities for our country. As individuals and as caucuses, we make promises to this country. And I've seen both sides' promises to this country, and one of them is not to include issues like this in must-pass legislation. Promise we all made. And it's a promise that, by moving forward with this amendment today, we're breaking. So I think that makes this far worse. So I feel bad for those involved. It's about more than just restricting government funding for abortion. This amendment prevents immigrant women who often already face horrible circumstances in federal immigration custody from making extremely personal medical decisions and hands that decision over to politicians. It is a solution in search of a problem. ICE funds don't pay for abortions, and another example of legislators playing politics with women's health. According to an ICE spokesman, since the agency was created in 2003, it has not paid for an abortion. And I heard today, this is in line with the Hyde Amendment, that ICE already adheres to this. So I understand we're in the business of messaging. This is messaging the wrong message, the wrong time on a critical issue. Thank you, and I yield back.
Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, let me just say, of course, I rise in strong opposition to this rider, but it's completely inappropriate and based on ideology. And it's really very shameful that, once again, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle will stop at nothing to introduce measures to further restrict a woman's right to choose and access to basic health services. The appropriations process should not be used to attack women's fundamental reproductive decisions. Politicians should stay out of these personal decisions. Members of Congress should not dictate personal freedoms and rights. Current ICE policy, as we all know, already prohibits abortions except in cases of life endangerment, rape, or incest. This harmful amendment would allow non-medical personnel, such as detention center employees with no medical training, to block access to life-saving care and information for vulnerable immigrant women. This war on women is all too familiar. We all know that opponents of women's reproductive health in Congress, they put politics before women's health. But inserting this irresponsible amendment into a debate on national and homeland security is just downright outrageous. Why would members of Congress want to impose such terrible, draconian policies that could destroy a woman's life by prohibiting abortions in case of life endangerment, rape, or incest. This is mean-spirited and it's downright wrong. Women deserve better.
Ms. DeLauro.
Rise in opposition to the amendment. Simply put, it is not needed. Everything contained in the amendment is already current law, and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement follow the dictates that are already on the books. Hyde Amendment, President's Executive Order 13535 already prevent federal funds from being used to provide abortions, with the limited exceptions of rape, incest, and when a mother's life is in danger. And the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Service already follow the standards of the Bureau of Prisons, making this amendment doubly duplicative. So we wonder why the majority has offered this amendment. Could it be for another purpose? Not yet disclosed, and we cannot and we should not be wasting time with these sorts of redundant and entirely political amendments. I'm often ruminate to myself, I guess, but I will out loud this time, that there appears to be a perverse obsession with women's reproductive systems on the part of the majority. And I don't understand it. Maybe someone on the other side of the aisle can begin to explain this obsession of wanting to dictate to women what they should do. And with that, I just urge my colleagues to reject this nonsense.
Would the Chairman Carter yield for a question?
Yes, sir.
Am I to understand that these limitations are identical to what's been carried in the CJS bill for almost 20 years?
Over 20 years.
And that this language was included in the President's request for the CJS bill?
Yes, sir, as stated.
Thank you very much. Any further discussion?
Mr. Chairman, I have I got a question for Mr. Carter, too. I just want to clarify.
Please stand.
Wanted to clarify that this would only be that federal funds would not be used to carry out the, is that?
That's correct.
Okay. The question is on the amendment of Mr. Carter. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. The ayes seem to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. Is there a roll call requested? Request a roll call. Sufficient number having raised their hands, a roll call is ordered. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Adderholt. Aye. Mr. Adderholt, aye. Mr. Alexander. Aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Bishop. No. Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Bonner. Aye. Mr. Bonner, aye. Mr. Calvert. Aye. Mr. Calvert, aye. Mr. Carter. Aye. Mr. Carter, aye. Mr. Cole. Mr. Crenshaw. Aye. Mr. Crenshaw, aye. Mr. Cuellar. Mr. Cuellar, no. Mr. Culberson. Mr. Culberson, aye. Ms. DeLauro. No. Ms. DeLauro, no. Mr. Dent. Mr. Dent, aye. Mr. Diaz-Balart. Mr. Farr. No. Mr. Farr, no. Mr. Fatah. No. Mr. Fatah, no. Mr. Fleischman. Aye. Mr. Fleischman, aye. Mr. Fortenberry. Aye. Mr. Fortenberry, aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen. Aye. Mr. Frelinghuysen, aye. Ms. Granger. Ms. Granger, aye. Mr. Graves. Aye. Mr. Graves, aye. Dr. Harris. Aye. Dr. Harris, aye. Ms. Herrera-Butler. Mr. Honda. Mr. Honda, no. Mr. Joyce. Mr. Joyce, aye. Ms. Capter. No. Ms. Capter, no. Mr. Kingston. Aye. Mr. Kingston, aye. Mr. Latham. Yes. Mr. Latham, aye. Ms. Lee. No. Ms. Lee, no. Mrs. Lowy. No. Mrs. Lowy, no. Ms. McCullum. No. Ms. McCullum, no. Mr. Moran. No. Mr. Moran, no. Mr. Nunnally. Aye. Mr. Nunnally, aye. Mr. Owens. No. Mr. Owens, no. Mr. Pastor. No. Mr. Pastor, no. Ms. Pingree. No. Ms. Pingree, no. Mr. Price. No. Mr. Price, no. Mr. Quigley. No. Mr. Quigley, no. Mr. Rogers. Aye. Mr. Rogers, aye. Mr. Rooney. Mr. Rooney, aye. Ms. Robo-Allard. No. Ms. Robo-Allard, no. Mr. Ryan. No. Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Serrano. No. Mr. Serrano, no. Mr. Simpson. Mr. Simpson, aye. Mr. Valadeo. Aye. Mr. Valadeo, aye. Mr. Visclosky? No. Mr. Visclosky, no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? No. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, no. Mr. Wolf?
Aye.
Mr. Wolf, aye. Mr. Womack? Aye. Mr. Womack, aye. Mr. Yoder? Aye. Mr. Yoder, aye. Mr. Young?
Are there members who have not cast a vote, who wish to vote? Or change your vote? Clerk will record. I failed to do something at the opening session yesterday that I should have done. I introduced Will Smith as the new clerk of the committee, but he is joined by his deputy clerk, Jim Kulikowski, who's been around here a bit. Welcome, Jim. On this vote, the yeas are 25, the nays are 21. The amendment is adopted. Mr. President.